1979, Vietnamese troops entered the capital of Cambodia, Phnom Penh. They expect fierce resistance. What they find instead is a ghost city. 2 million people gone. The streets are empty. Homes abandoned. Food is still sitting on tables. Clock stopped at the exact moment families fled. It looks like an apocalypse. Like a rapture. Like the end of the world happened overnight. But this is not science fiction. This is real. And it was engineered by one man. His name was Saloth Sâr. You know him as Pol Pot. In just 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, he killed a quarter of his own country. Between 1.7 and 2 million people out of a population of just 8 million. For context, that is a higher percentage than the Holocaust. It happened faster than the Rwandan genocide. And it was more brutal and systematic than Stalin's Great Purge. And yet, almost no one talks about it. This is not just the story of a mad dictator. This is the story of how a utopian ideology turned into hell on earth. How a modern nation was dragged back into the Stone Age overnight. And most disturbingly, how the world allowed it to happen. Even after it knew. My name is your name. Today, we are dissecting one of the worst crimes of the 20th century. A genocide so extreme and so politically inconvenient that it was nearly erased from global memory. Because forgetting history does not make it disappear. It makes it repeat. And this story must never be repeated. Pol Pot was born Saloth Sâr on May 19, 1925, in the village of Prek Spauv, Cambodia, about 160 kilometers north of Phnom Penh. Contrary to popular belief, he was not born poor. He was not born oppressed. He was not born a victim. His family was wealthy landowners. Privileged. Connected to power. His sister, Saruong, became a concubine of King Monivong. As a child, Saloth lived inside the royal palace for 6 years. He was educated, well-fed, protected. He learned traditional Khmer dance. He attended elite Buddhist schools. He wore silk. This was Cambodia under French colonial rule, part of French Indochina. Local elites like Saloth's family collaborated with the French. They benefited from the system. They were the buffer class between colonizer and peasant. But young Saloth grew up witnessing a stark contradiction. Luxury in the palace. Misery in the countryside. French rulers above. Cambodian peasants below. Modern machines in the cities. Ancient tools in the rice fields. Something inside him began to crack. Not empathy, but resentment. In 1949, at age 24, Saloth received a government scholarship to study in Paris. Officially, his subject was radio engineering. Unofficially, it was a revolution. Post-war Paris in the late 1940s and early 50s was an intellectual pressure cooker. Existentialism. Marxism. Anti-colonialism. Sartre. Camus. Fanon. The French Communist Party was powerful and influential. Saloth joined the Cercle Marxiste, a Marxist study circle connected to the party. There, he met the men who would later become the architects of Cambodia's destruction. Ieng Sary, future Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. Khieu Samphan, future Head of State. Sun Sen, future defense minister. Together, they consumed Marx, Lenin, Stalin, and most importantly, Mao Zedong. They debated endlessly about revolution, about class struggle, about the dictatorship of the proletariat, about how to violently reshape society into something pure. But here's the thing. Saloth Sâr was not brilliant. He was not a genius revolutionary theorist. He failed his university exams 3 years in a row. His scholarship was revoked in 1952. He returned to Cambodia in 1953. No degree. No recognition. Full of half-understood ideology. And desperate to prove himself. Back home, Cambodia was in chaos. France had just been defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Vietnam was being split into two. Laos was in turmoil. The Cold War was accelerating across Southeast Asia. King Norodom Sihanouk was trying to navigate between the superpowers, playing the Americans, the Soviets, the Chinese, and the French against each other. Saloth joined Cambodia's underground communist movement, the Khmer People's Revolutionary Party. He became a teacher in a private school by day, a revolutionary organizer by night. In 1960, the party held a secret congress in a Phnom Penh railway station. They renamed themselves the Workers' Party of Kampuchea. Saloth was rising. In 1963, the party's general secretary, Chu Samath, disappeared. He was almost certainly assassinated by Sihanouk's secret police. Saloth Sâr took his place. And he adopted a new name. Pol Pot. The meaning remains unclear. Some say Pol comes from politique, French for politics. Others say Pot is short for Pot Thai, a Khmer name. But the name itself didn't matter. What mattered was the transformation. A man became a myth. A person became a cipher. An identity dissolved into ideology. Fearing arrest, Pol Pot and his inner circle fled into the jungle, to the remote northeastern provinces bordering Vietnam and Laos. There, hidden in the forests, they began building an army. They recruited from ethnic minorities, from displaced peasants, from those who hated the corrupt Phnom Penh elite. They called themselves the Khmer Rouge, the Red Khmers. The name was actually given to them by Sihanouk as an insult. But it stuck. And it would soon become synonymous with mass murder. Everything changed in 1969. On March 18, under orders from President Richard Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, American B-52 bombers began secretly dropping payloads over Cambodia. The operation was called Operation Menu. And it was one of the most catastrophic decisions in modern military history. Why bomb Cambodia? Because North Vietnamese forces were using supply routes through eastern Cambodia, part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail network. The US wanted to cut those routes. But there was a problem. Cambodia was officially neutral. Bombing it was illegal under international law. So Nixon and Kissinger kept it secret, even from Congress. For 4 years, from 1969 to 1973, American planes dropped nearly 2.8 million tons of bombs on Cambodian soil. That's more explosive power than all the bombs dropped during World War II. Over 540,000 individual bombs. The countryside was carpet-bombed. Villages evaporated. Rice paddies turned into craters. Entire families were incinerated in their sleep. Estimates vary, but between 150,000 and 500,000 Cambodian civilians died in the bombing. And for every person killed, 10 more were displaced. Refugees poured into Phnom Penh, swelling the city's population from 600,000 to over 2 million by 1975. But many didn't flee to the cities. They fled to the jungle, to the Khmer Rouge. Every bombing raid became a recruiting tool for Pol Pot. Imagine, you're a rice farmer. Your village has been there for centuries. One night, the sky lights up. The earth shakes. When dawn comes, half your family is dead. Your neighbors are buried under rubble. Your rice paddies are poisoned. Who do you blame? The government in Phnom Penh allied with the Americans. Who offers you a gun and a chance for revenge? The Khmer Rouge. Between 1970 and 1975, Pol Pot's forces grew from fewer than 5,000 fighters to more than 70,000. The United States didn't just fail to stop the Khmer Rouge. It created them. Meanwhile, in 1970, a US-backed coup overthrew King Sihanouk. General Lon Nol took power. He was corrupt, incompetent, and brutal. The civil war intensified. The Khmer Rouge advanced. By early 1975, they surrounded Phnom Penh. The city was starving. The government was collapsing. Defeat was inevitable. On April 17, 1975, Khmer Rouge soldiers marched into the capital. At first, people cheered. The war was over. Peace had come. Children waved at the soldiers. Some offered them flowers. But the soldiers didn't smile back. They wore black uniforms. They carried AK-47s. Their faces were blank. Many were teenagers, some as young as 12 or 13. They had been raised in the jungle. Indoctrinated. Told that city people were parasites. Enemies of the revolution. Within hours, the loudspeakers began blaring. All citizens must evacuate the city immediately. The Americans are going to bomb Phnom Penh. You will return in 3 days. This is temporary. It was a lie. Hospitals were emptied. Patients still hooked to fours were forced to walk. The elderly were dragged from their beds. Pregnant women gave birth on roadsides. 2 million people, the entire population of Phnom Penh, were expelled in less than 48 hours. No food. No water. No transport. They walked. Hundreds died on the roads from exhaustion. From dehydration. From heat stroke. The Khmer Rouge shot anyone who resisted. Anyone who asked questions. Anyone who moved too slowly. The streets of Phnom Penh, once bustling with life, fell silent. Buildings stood empty. Markets abandoned. Cars left where they stopped. It looked like the Rapture. But this wasn't divine judgment. This was year zero. Pol Pot's ideology was simple. Cambodia would return to an agrarian utopia. No cities. No money. No private property. No technology. No religion. No education. No family. Only rice. Only the collective. Only the revolution. He called it year zero. History, erased. Culture destroyed. Identity forbidden. The entire nation became a slave labor camp. Everyone was forced to work in the rice fields, 12 to 14 hours a day, under the burning sun. Men, women, children, the elderly, everyone. Your previous life didn't matter. If you were a doctor, you would plant rice. If you were a teacher, you planted rice. If you were a monk, you planted rice. The Khmer Rouge divided the population into categories. Old people, rural peasants who supported the revolution. New people, city dwellers, the educated, anyone from Phnom Penh. New people were marked for death. Not immediately, but slowly. Through starvation. Through overwork. Through re-education. Rations were deliberately kept minimal. A single bowl of watery rice gruel per day. Sometimes with a few grains of salt. Sometimes with insects or wild plants. That was it. Malnutrition became universal. People ate grass, tree bark, insects, rats. Some resorted to cannibalism. Over 1 million people died from starvation and exhaustion alone. But starvation was just one method. The Khmer Rouge hunted intellectuals. Anyone who wore glasses was suspect. It meant you could read. Anyone who spoke a foreign language. Anyone with soft hands meant you didn't do manual labor. Teachers were executed. Doctors were executed. Engineers were executed. Lawyers were executed. Even speaking about your past was dangerous. If you accidentally used a French word, you could be killed. If you showed knowledge of science or mathematics, you could be killed. The regime wanted a population of blank slates. Obedient. Uneducated. Controllable. Religion was obliterated. Cambodia was 95% Buddhist. The Khmer Rouge destroyed over 3,000 temples. Monks were defrocked, forced to work in fields or executed outright. Sacred texts were burned. Statues smashed. Pagodas turned into warehouses or prisons. Buddhism wasn't just banned. It was culturally erased. Families were torn apart. Children were separated from their parents and raised in communal camps. They were taught to spy on adults. To report anyone who spoke against Angkar, the organization. Angkar was the state. Angkar was your family. Angkar was God. One survivor recalled. They told us, Angkar is your mother and father now. Forget your parents. If they oppose the revolution, you must denounce them. Marriages were arranged by the state. Mass weddings of dozens or hundreds of couples at once. You didn't choose your spouse. The revolution chose for you. And if you refused? Death. Everything was controlled. When you woke. What you ate. Where did you work? Who do you speak to? What did you think? There was no privacy. No autonomy. No hope. One slogan haunted the camps. To keep you is no benefit. To destroy you is no loss. Your life had no value. You were replaceable. Expendable. And if you were even suspected of disloyalty to Angkar, to Pol Pot, to the revolution, you disappeared. Look at this face. Look closely at his smile. It is soft, fatherly, calm. This man never raised his voice. He never held a gun in public. His former students described him as a gentle teacher who loved French literature. But in just 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, this man orchestrated the murder of 25% of his own country's population. Imagine if a quarter of the United States or the United Kingdom vanished. Not by a plague, not by a natural disaster, but by design, by mathematics. In 1979, when soldiers finally entered the capital city of Phnom Penh, they found a ghost town. Food was still sitting on tables. Clocks had stopped. It looked like the end of the world had happened overnight. This is not a dystopian fiction. This is the true story of Saloth Sâr, the man you know as Pol Pot. And this is the story of how the world watched a nation destroy itself and did nothing. To understand the monster, we must first unlearn the myth. Pol Pot was not born a peasant. He was not born in poverty. He was born Saloth Sâr in 1925 into a family of wealthy landowners with connections to the royal palace. He grew up with privilege. He learned traditional dance. He lived a life that 99% of Cambodians could only dream of. In 1949, he went to Paris on a government scholarship. This is the first irony. The ideology that would destroy Cambodia was not born in the rice fields of Asia. It was born in the cafes of Europe. In Paris, Saloth Sâr didn't study engineering as he was supposed to. He studied revolution. He fell in with a circle of Marxist intellectuals. They read Stalin. They read Mao. They convinced themselves that the only way to save a country was to burn it down and start over. But Saloth Sâr was not a brilliant student. He failed his exams 3 times. He returned to Cambodia in 1953 without a degree, but with a dangerous level of confidence. He believed he knew exactly what was wrong with the world. For the next decade, he operated in the shadows. He climbed the ranks of Cambodia's underground communist movement. He was patient. He was quiet. While others gave speeches, he built alliances. He changed his name to Pol Pot. A name with no meaning. A name that sounded like nothing. He was becoming a phantom. But a phantom needs chaos to thrive. And in 1969, the United States gave him exactly that. President Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger launched Operation Menu. It was a secret bombing campaign. Over 4 years, American B-52 bombers dropped more explosives on Cambodia than were dropped on Japan during World War II. The countryside was decimated. Villages were vaporized. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died. This was the fuel Pol Pot needed. For every bomb that fell, the Khmer Rouge gained 10 new recruits. Angry, grieving farmers who had lost everything. They didn't know what Marxism was. They just knew that the sky was falling and the men in black pajamas promised them revenge. By April 1975, the Khmer Rouge had surrounded the capital. The government surrendered. The people of Phnom Penh cheered as the soldiers marched in. They thought the war was over. They thought peace had finally come. They were wrong. Within hours, loudspeakers blared a single command: leave the city. Everyone. The sick. The elderly. Children. 2 million people were forced onto the roads at gunpoint. They were told the Americans were going to bomb the city. It was a lie. This was the beginning of Year Zero. Pol Pot wanted to restart history. He believed that cities were evil. That technology was corrupt. That money was a disease. He wanted to turn Cambodia into a massive agrarian collective. A peasant utopia. But to build this utopia, he had to destroy the people. The population was divided. The old people, the rural peasants, were trusted. The new people, the city dwellers, were the enemy. If you wore glasses, you were killed because it meant you were intellectual. If you spoke a foreign language, you were killed. If you had soft hands, it meant you didn't work in the fields, so you were killed. Doctors, teachers, engineers, monks. They were hunted down like animals. But how do you control millions of people with a relatively small army? You don't just use fear. You use psychology. This brings us to the most terrifying aspect of the regime, the mechanics of control. Pol Pot knew that adults were difficult to brainwash. They had memories of the old world. They had morals. So, the Khmer Rouge focused on the children. They separated children from their parents. They put them in indoctrination camps. These children were taught that Angkar, the organization, was their true mother and father. They were desensitized to violence systematically. First, they were taught to torture animals. Then, they were taught to kill. By the time they were 12 or 13, they were emotionless killing machines. Survivors tell stories of their own children spying on them. If a father complained about the lack of food, his son would report him to the soldiers. That night, the father would disappear. The regime destroyed the most fundamental unit of human survival, the family trust. This psychological machinery fed the physical slaughter. The center of this horror was S21. A former high school turned into a torture factory. Over 12,000 people entered S21. Fewer than 10 survived. The prisoners were photographed. They were tortured until they confessed to being CIA agents or KGB spies. These were impossible crimes. But the truth didn't matter. The regime needed enemies to justify its own paranoia. Once they confessed, they were trucked out to Choangek. The killing fields. Bullets were expensive. The Khmer Rouge did not want to waste them on traitors. So they used iron bars. Machetes. The axles of ox carts. They bludgeoned people to death in the dark, while loudspeakers played revolutionary songs to drown out the screams. There is a tree at Choangek. It is covered in bracelets today. But back then, it was used for something else. Soldiers would grab babies by their feet and smash their heads against the trunk of this tree. They did this in front of the mothers. Their logic was brutal. To dig up the grass, one must remove even the roots. By 1978, the regime was consuming itself. Pol Pot saw traitors everywhere. He purged his own commanders. He attacked Vietnam, believing he was invincible. That was his mistake. In December 1978, Vietnam invaded. The Khmer Rouge collapsed. When the Vietnamese troops walked into S21, they found bodies still shackled to the beds. The blood was still wet. You would think the world would celebrate the end of this nightmare. You would think Pol Pot would be dragged to court. But that is not what happened. This is the part of history that gets left out. The United States, China, and the UK, they didn't arrest the Khmer Rouge. They supported them. In the twisted logic of the Cold War, Vietnam was an ally of the Soviet Union. So, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The US and China funneled weapons and money to Pol Pot's remaining forces in the jungle. For over a decade, the man who committed genocide continued to represent Cambodia at the United Nations. Pol Pot never faced justice. He lived for 20 more years. He died in his bed in the jungle in 1998. He was never handcuffed. He was never put in a cell. When a journalist asked him if he felt remorse, he simply said, "My conscience is clear." Today, Cambodia is rebuilding. But the scars are everywhere. The median age in Cambodia is young because an entire generation is missing. We tell this story not just to document horror, but to recognize the pattern. It starts with words. It starts with us versus them. It starts with the promise of a utopia that requires just a little bit of violence to achieve. Pol Pot showed us that civilization is fragile. It can be stripped away in days. All it takes is the silence of good people and the arrogance of a few men who think they can rewrite human nature. If you look at the photos from S21, don't just look at the fear. Look at the confusion. They look like us. They were us. Never forget. The nerve center of terror was a former high school in Phnom Penh. Its name was Chul Sleng. The Khmer Rouge called it S21, Security Prison 21. Between 1975 and 1979, at least 12,000 to 20,000 people passed through its gates. Fewer than a dozen survived. S21 was run by a man named Kang Kek Yu, known as Comrade Dutch. Dutch was a former school teacher. Soft-spoken. Meticulous. Terrifyingly efficient. He kept detailed records. Every prisoner was photographed. Every confession documented. Every torture session logged. Victims included former government officials, ethnic Vietnamese, ethnic Chinese, Cham Muslims, intellectuals, and eventually Khmer Rouge members themselves. Pol Pot was paranoid. He saw traitors everywhere. Entire military units were arrested and executed for suspected disloyalty. Regional leaders were purged. Even Dutch's own staff were periodically killed and replaced. The revolution devoured itself. At S21, torture was systematic. Prisoners were chained to metal bed frames. They were whipped, electrocuted, waterboarded, suffocated with plastic bags. Fingernails and toenails were ripped out. Some had their heads submerged in jars filled with water and excrement. Dutch demanded confessions, not of real crimes, but of imagined conspiracies. Prisoners were forced to admit they were CIA agents, or KGB spies, or Vietnamese infiltrators. Under torture, people confessed to anything. Then they were asked to name accomplices. So they named friends, family members, colleagues, who were then arrested and tortured and forced to name more names. A spiral of death. Once a confession was signed, the prisoner was taken away. At night. In trucks. to a place 15 kilometers outside Phnom Penh. Choeongek. The Killing Fields. Choeongek was a quiet orchard. At night, trucks arrived carrying prisoners, blindfolded, hands bound. They were lined up at the edge of mass graves. Bullets were expensive, so the Khmer Rouge used farm tools. Iron bars, hoes, sharpened bamboo sticks, machetes. Prisoners were bludgeoned to death, one by one, then pushed into pits. Sometimes they were still alive when buried. The executioners played loud revolutionary music over loudspeakers to drown out the screams. At Choeongek today, there is a tree. It's called the Killing Tree. Against this tree, Khmer Rouge soldiers smashed infants and small children. They grabbed them by the legs, swung them, and smashed their heads against the trunk, in front of their mothers. Then threw the bodies into the pit. Why? To eliminate the seeds of revenge. In total, there are over 300 known killing sites across Cambodia. But the true number is likely much higher. Mass graves are still being discovered. In fields, beneath homes, along riverbanks. Over 1.3 million bodies have been exhumed. Many more remain buried. At the Choeongek Memorial today, thousands of skulls are displayed in a glass stupa, a Buddhist tower. Row after row. Shattered. Fractured. Some with bullet holes. Most with blunt force trauma. Each skull represents a person. A life. A story lost forever. By 1978, reports were leaking out. Refugees arriving in Thailand told horrifying stories. Journalists began investigating. The world was starting to know. But no one intervened. Why? Because Cambodia was a geopolitical pawn. In December 1978, Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union, invaded Cambodia. They quickly routed the Khmer Rouge. On January 7, 1979, Vietnamese forces liberated Phnom Penh. They found a city of ghosts. Decomposing bodies in the streets. Abandoned torture centers. Files detailing mass murder. The Vietnamese installed a new government led by former Khmer Rouge defectors. You'd think the world would celebrate. But instead, the West condemned Vietnam. The United States. The United Kingdom. China. ASEAN nations. All denounced the invasion as illegal aggression. And here's the most disgusting part. They continue to recognize the Khmer Rouge as Cambodia's legitimate government. At the United Nations, the Khmer Rouge kept Cambodia's seat until 1993. Pol Pot's diplomats sat in the General Assembly, representing a regime that had just committed genocide. Why this insanity? Cold War logic. Vietnam was aligned with the Soviet Union. China hated Vietnam. The US hated the Soviets. So America and China supported the Khmer Rouge, even after knowing about the genocide. Henry Kissinger told the Thai foreign minister in 1979, "You should tell the Cambodians that we will be friends with them. They are murderous thugs, but we won't let that stand in our way." Let me repeat that. They are murderous thugs, but we won't let that stand in our way. Genocide was inconvenient. But geopolitics came first. The US and China funneled weapons and money to the Khmer Rouge throughout the 1980s. They helped Pol Pot's forces wage a guerrilla war against the Vietnamese-backed government. Pol Pot himself retreated to the jungle along the Thai border. Protected, supplied, enabled by the so-called free world. Hundreds of thousands of Cambodians fled to refugee camps in Thailand. International aid organizations struggled to help. But for over a decade, the Khmer Rouge continued to exist as a fighting force, backed by Western and Chinese arms. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The genocide didn't end in 1979. It was prolonged by deliberate policy. Pol Pot never faced trial. He lived in the jungle for nearly 20 years after his regime fell. In the 1990s, as Cambodia stabilized, the Khmer Rouge fractured. Internal purges, defections, paranoia. In 1997, Pol Pot ordered the execution of his longtime ally, Son Sen, and his entire family, 14 people. It was a massacre too far. His own commanders turned on him. In July 1997, Pol Pot was arrested by his former comrades. He was put on trial by the Khmer Rouge themselves. A show trial. He was sentenced to house arrest. Not for genocide, but for internal betrayal. On April 15, 1998, Pol Pot died. In a small hut. In the jungle. Of heart failure. He was 73 years old. He died surrounded by his wife and daughter. He was never extradited. Never tried by an international court. Never held accountable. One journalist who interviewed him shortly before his death asked, "Do you regret anything?" Pol Pot replied, "My conscience is clear." He felt no remorse. None. It wasn't until 2006, 27 years after the genocide ended, that a UN-backed tribunal was established. The Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, ECCC. It convicted Comrade Dutch, life in prison, died in 2020. Nguyen Chia, brother number 2, life in prison, died in 2019. Q Samphan, head of state, life in prison, still alive. But most leaders? Dead before trial. Or never charged. The tribunal cost over $300 million. It took over a decade. And it convicted 3 men. Justice, too little, too late. Today, Cambodia has a population of over 17 million. The median age is 26. Most Cambodians were born after the genocide. They learn about it in school, briefly. But the subject is still politically sensitive. Because many of today's leaders were once part of the system. Hun Sen, who ruled Cambodia from 1985 to 2023, was a former Khmer Rouge commander. He defected in 1977, but his past remains controversial. His son, Hun Manet, is now Prime Minister. Cambodia is rebuilding. But the scars remain. Chul Sleng is now a museum. Over 100,000 people visit each year. They walk through the classrooms turned torture chambers. They see the rusted bed frames, the shackles, the photographs of victims staring blankly at the camera moments before death. At Choang Ek, tourists stand before the stupa filled with skulls. They walk past mass graves, still visible as depressions in the earth. Bone fragments still surface after heavy rain. These sites exist so the world remembers. But memory is fragile. Survivors are aging. Most are now in their 70s and 80s. Soon there will be no living witnesses. Only documents. Only bones. Only stories we choose to tell or forget. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge killed between 1.7 and 2 million Cambodians. That's 21% of the population. 1 in every 5 people. Gone. But these are not just statistics. These were individuals. Mothers. Fathers. Children. Teachers. Monks. Artists. Dreamers. 2 million futures erased. 2 million stories that will never be told. And the world let it happen. Not out of ignorance, but out of choice. Political expediency. Cold War calculus. Indifference disguised as diplomacy. We study history not to become paralyzed by horror, but to recognize the warning signs. When you hear talk of purifying society, of eliminating enemies within, of starting over from zero, of utopias enforced through violence, remember Cambodia. Remember Pol Pot. Remember the killing fields. Remember that genocide doesn't begin with mass graves. It begins with rhetoric, with dehumanization, with the belief that some lives are worth less than others, and with the silence of those who could speak but choose not to. Never forget. Never again. Thank you for watching. If this video was meaningful to you, subscribe, share it, and leave a comment. There are resources in the description for further learning. And most importantly, talk about this. Because the moment we stop talking about atrocities like this, it is the moment we risk repeating them. I'll see you in the next video.